there's a website that exists that's freely accessible to anyone who wants to go and look at it. And it was created a few years ago as part of a research project from the University of Cambridge. And what the website does is an interactive map, and it details every single recorded homicide that we know about from the City of London from the 14th century. So I think I'm going to do a couple of videos on this map because I think it's so interesting to look at crime in the past. It's one of the things that really interests me, looking at crime and punishment, especially in medieval England, because we can kind of explore and draw parallels to modern England and see how things have changed, whether the crime rates are any different. And that's one of the reasons this map was created. It was to accompany a research paper specifically about the increase in crime, whether there was an increase or decrease in crime over the years, and looking at how much more dangerous London was, medieval London to modern London. It's really interesting. Unfortunately, the problem with medieval maps and drawing parallels to modern London versus medieval London is that the city has changed quite a bit. My plan for this video was to identify a couple of interesting murders and then go to the place where they happened, show you the area, and explain to you what happened at the time. The problem is, if I did that today, we'd be looking outside a McDonald's or a Pret or a Costa, and I don't think it would be so interesting. So I decided to come to a park, which hopefully looks nice, and just talk you through them, and then I can overlay pictures of where they were, where the murders happened in London. The first one happened on the 1st of August 1324. Obviously this isn't the first murder on the map, it's just one of the first murders that I came across that I thought looked really interesting. And the interesting thing about it is that it was two members of the higher social strata. They weren't nobility. One of them was a knight. He was a retired knight who had fought overseas. His name was Sir Francis de Villers, and the other man was a rector, so he was a clergyman from Hampshire. His name was John of Woodhall. And what happened was they were both going to see the Bishop of Bath and Wells, who had a townhouse in the west side of the City of London. I can show you where that is on this map there. And witnesses report that they were quarrelling on the way to the house. No one's entirely sure about what, or if someone was sure, it hasn't been recorded, which is a shame. So this quarrel between the two men, Francis and John, got quite heated, especially as they were approaching the house of the Bishop of Bath and Wells. John of Woodhall drew his sword, as did Sir Francis, and they fought very briefly before John of Woodhall struck Sir Francis on the side of the head with his sword and drew blood. He gouged him, and the wound was about 5 inches long and 1 inch deep. It got really deep into his skull. Sir Francis, who was gravely injured, managed to get himself back to his house. In the end, neither of them actually saw the bishop. So Francis got himself back to his house, and he managed to survive for just under a week before dying. And he was given the last sacraments, he was confessed, and he died at home. The clergyman, John of Woodhall, was arrested immediately and taken into custody by John of Oxford, who's the sheriff. Now I've looked for references to John of Oxford, who was the sheriff in that area in August 1324. I've looked for what might have happened to John of Woodhall. I've looked for prison records, death records. I can't find anything. I don't know what happened to him. I'm sure someone does. There's probably a source out there that details exactly what happened, but I can't find it, which is a shame. But I think the interesting thing to take away from this is that in medieval London, even a clergyman, a man of God, could kill a knight. And that's not, that's not dramatic, that's not newfound, it's just a very interesting thing to think about. And the next murder that I found, which took place in pretty much the exact same area and 2 years later. It was a similar power balance kind of thing. So it was a businessman, a shop owner, quite successful. He was a skinner. He was killed by a servant, and this was maybe 50 meters further west than where the Sir Francis murder happened. So the second murder happened right next to St Dunstan in the West Church, which is, the site is still there in medieval London. The site's still there in modern London even, from medieval London. The church has changed very dramatically, having been renovated and rebuilt. So this murder actually had a similar kind of form to the one in 1324 that I just spoke about. It was two men, one called William Devenice, who was a skinner, a shop owner and a businessman, and the servant was called William de Kirkby. And there was an argument, they were having an argument in the street, again not recorded about what they were arguing about, for how long and when it started, but the result of it was that the servant, William de Kirkby, the servant Walter de Kirkby, drew his sword and hit William on the top of the head, and a similar sized wound, 4 inches long, 1 inch thick, into the brain. And William somehow also managed to survive for a week, and he died, I believe it was the day before Valentine's Day, the 13th of February 1326. Again, he was given the last sacraments, he was confessed, and he passed away that evening. The interesting thing about this murder is that no one ever found the killer. Walter fled immediately. He had no belongings. He left his place of work. He never returned, and no one ever found him. So unfortunately, we can't be sure what happened to him. I think the interesting thing about these two murders is the setup and the execution. The setup for both was very, very similar, as was the execution. Both killed by a sword to the head over an argument, a quarrel, something that probably didn't warrant one of the two sides being killed. But it's an interesting thing to look at, to think that in medieval London this was a common occurrence. Two people who on any other day probably wouldn't have killed someone got into an argument, a heated exchange, and possibly their pride was hurt, possibly it was a matter of honour, but one of them died. And it happened twice, and it happened a lot more. And I think if I am going to do other videos on this, I'll explore that a little bit more in depth. But it's very interesting to look at societal values and attitudes around honour and pride and arguments and being armed. Obviously you don't walk around London today with a sword at your belt, and if you did get into an argument, I don't know anyone, and I've never come across anyone who has been killed because of an argument or even got into a fight, unless they were drunk, which is a probability, maybe possibility. But the upshot of this is that you can use this map and you can use records of murders and homicides to explore how deadly a place was. You're looking at 14th century London and you compare it to modern day London or 20th century London. If you want to do a century by century comparison, you could explore how many homicides happened in what areas, and whether there were more or less at which time. But obviously the more important thing you've got to think about is healthcare, because yes, in 14th century London, if you were stabbed, you would probably die. You didn't have emergency services, didn't have anywhere near as much medicine or medicinal knowledge as we do now, and the likelihood is that you're going to die. Whereas if you're stabbed today in modern London, just outside St Paul's or something, you'll have an ambulance on you within 4 or 5 minutes. You'll have paramedics and doctors treating you, have access to the best medicine, and if you do manage to survive for an hour, let alone a week, then you probably will be okay. So it's interesting to explore not just how many homicides occurred at which time, but how many crimes, because it might be that yes, there were more homicides in 14th century London, but that was because of a different factor rather than, you know, there was more crime.